Hey all, welcome to Parker's Reefs. Today's episode we're going to check out the latest automatic tester from GHL, the Ion Director. Alright guys, thank you for joining me in another episode of Parker's Reefs, and I'm happy to say that I've managed to get hold of a GHL Ion Director, a bit of a unicorn in the industry. These guys have talked about releasing this unit for many years now, and to finally see one not only out in the wild but actually here in Australia is something else. And my good friend Dave has loaned me this one for the purpose of this review, which is awesome because one, I didn't have to pay for it, and two, it hasn't come from the manufacturer or distributor, so you know I can give a completely unbiased view on what I feel this GHL Ion Director is like, because I have to be fairly honest, I've been super critical of GHL's products to date, so I'm curious to see how this standalone unit goes. Now, talking about the Ion Director, for those of you who do not know, this is the first probe-based automatic tester on the market, so it does not replicate the process of tritation tests like all of the other, at least to my knowledge, all of the other automatic testers on the market do. This one actually has a singular probe, which it has a couple of reference fluids that go in to calibrate and prepare the probe. Then a water sample comes in, and then based off that water sample, this unit's going to give us readings of calcium, magnesium, potassium, sodium, and nitrate, all at the same time. It doesn't have to do those tests individually. So I'm super excited to give it a shot, because I do feel like this is the absolute future of automatic water testing for our reef tanks. So I guess the next thing we should really do is open this box up. I haven't done that yet. See what we get with it, and start setting it up, which I have heard can be a little bit difficult. So I guess we better jump off the deep end and see how we go. All right, I'm not going to go over what's on the box, because I suspect everything that's on the box should be inside the box. So let's rip it open. There's a little sleeve that sits on top, and then we should be able to slide this open. All right. So we get a whole heap of different languages of warnings and bits and pieces like that I must admit I'm never a big fan of reading. We get, oh wow, here it is here. The actual probe itself. This is the magic, and it looks so simple and basic and, dare I say, cheap. This probe's what's potentially going to change the automatic testing world on its head. So I am surprised to see that just come in a bit of bubble wrap with no fluids or anything like that. I mean, I'm obviously comparing to your traditional pH probes, conductivity probes and things like that. To see it shipped dry is just different. All right, we get a couple of reference fluids. Now, the Ion Director is big on saying it doesn't need reagents, but it does need reference fluids, and it's got an A and a B, which, as far as I'm concerned, a reference fluid may as well be a reagent, but you know, no big deal. It needs two reagents or reference fluids, so be it. We get a USB cable which connects things together. We get an Australian power plug there, happy days. We get a little power splitter, because we have one power supply which powers both the doser and the Ion Director. This kit that I have here is a standalone setup, so you don't need the GHL Profilux to run this unit. You can actually have a standalone doser which acts as a controller, and that will connect to the Director. We get some tubing which you're going to use to connect all the hoses and lines up. Get a bunch of bits and pieces like that. We get some little tubing connectors. We get, what's this going to be, the power supply? Yep, power supply. We get a PAB cable, I believe they pronounce it, which is essentially an Ethernet cable. Oh, that's a nice touch. We get a couple of lids with holes in them for the, I'm assuming that's for this, so that you can run your dosing lines nice and neatly into the reference fluids. That's neat. We get a little water filter. We get, oh, you've got all sorts of protective foam around this one. This is the Ion Director itself. Let's rip this open. Oh yeah, it's a fancy looking bit of kit, I'll give you that. Very nice. So all our water samples coming in and out of the unit go on the front here, as well as a vent on the back. That big old probe that we saw here, this guy here is going to slide into the side here, and somehow inside there it does have a warranty sticker, so I can't crack it open and have a look without avoiding that. I'd love to see how the water sits around this probe, but so be it. Super interesting. And then last but not least is the doser that runs it. Let's rip this guy open too, without breaking it, because I do have to give this back to my buddy. Please don't break it. GHL's standalone 4-head doser. And I tell you what, I know I'm critical on GHL, but man, their gear does feel nice. And you'll note these are actually designed to sit on top of each other, so you can get that real clean industrial sort of look of just module after module, and you can have an additional doser to make some dosing changes to the results that it gets, or you can have the GHL Director with its feed pump. You can stack these units all on top of each other, and the Profilux 4 itself all have the same form factor, so you get this real cool sort of AV cabinet style look, which is super, super neat. And I got to say, the construction is nice. This aluminium, there is some plastic on there, but it's very nicely done. In fact, there's not a lot of weight to the Ion Director. There's a bit more to the doser, which makes sense. There's going to be more motors and things in there, but I think that's it. I think, what's this? We get a bit of a catalog. Yeah, different languages, product catalog, in case you want to expand your GHL ecosystem. I suspect I'm going to have my hands full on setting this guy up, and that's what I might jump onto next. I have noticed one of the adhesive feet has come off already. Stick that back on. No big deal, no reflection really, but still, I'd rather they stuck on. Cool, all right. Let me grab the instructions from their website, which is listed here. It does tell you straight up, make sure, one of these I'm sure tells you, don't try and proceed, jump online and grab the manual. Now from my pre-reading, and I have already had a look at the manual is, I don't want to say it's utterly useless, but it's not far from it. However, if you go into the knowledge base, there is a very nice compartmentalized step-by-step guide on how to set this up, rather than the very abstract manual, which is very little use in setting these up. So I'm going to jump online, have a look at that step-by-step guide, get this unit running, and we'll go from there. All right, now as touched on the aquariumcomputer.com website, which is the GHL website, I personally found the manual to be fairly confusing and misleading. But if you do go to support and then you go to knowledge base, you'll find this section where you can go through and pick specifically the Ion Director setup guide, and it is very nicely laid out in 3 separate parts. Now, we're going to go through each of these parts fairly quickly, but I just want to share with you my process of setting it up, because it was fairly difficult. Now, we're going to start off with part 1, and in here it tells you some of the basics, tells you about what you get in the packages, what the cable is, what cables you need if you need an extra PAB cable, the ports, all that stuff. I feel like if you've got to this part, you probably know. Plus, I will give kudos to GHL. They have labeled each of the ports and things on the Ion Director very clearly, so I don't know, you can kind of look at it and tell what needs to go where, but it is good that they have it here for you to quickly reference. The first step you really need to do is find a suitable location for your Ion Director. Now, it does say that it is important that it needs to be away from things like power supplies and ballasts, because it could get electrical interference. So I found a pretty good spot on my sump, which gives me good access to water, a good spot to set the reference fluids, and away from any sort of any interference it should get. Now, funnily enough, I did find this next step interesting. The first real step you have to do after than just setting it down somewhere is to power it on, which, I don't know, I found interesting. So you find a location, plug the power into both units and turn it on. Easy enough. And you can then connect the PAB cable, which seems odd. I thought you would connect the PAB cable first, but power it on, then connect the PAB cable, which, like I touched on, is basically that Ethernet cable, but it is labeled PAB on the doser. Don't connect it to the LAN connector. Connect it up to one of the PAB cables and connect it to your Ion Director. From there, it gives you some instructions if you're connecting up to a Profilux, but I'm not, so I'm going to skip past that. Now, the next step is to download GHL Connect. Now, this part, I mean, the instructions are quite good here, but I will just point out there is way too many applications for GHL. There's GHL Connect, which is I guess a phone and tablet based app. There's GHL Control Center, which is a Windows PC app. There is My GHL, which is a web based application. And then devices have a web interface as well, directly on the LAN that they're on. So you can put in their IP address and connect into them that way as well. Super, super confusing, but let's roll with it. The first thing I'm going to do is download this app. So I've downloaded that onto my phone. You can set the slave doser, sorry, the standalone doser. You jump into it, it'll give you a hotspot. You connect to that hotspot. add the device into the app, which will be the doser, not the Ion Director, because the doser is actually what we're connecting to and is what controls the Ion Director. So we go into that. The default setting should work. You can give it a name. It will come up with an error saying that you couldn't log into my GHL because, well, you're offline. You're connected to the doser's hotspot, does not have internet connectivity. It's a little clunky. I reckon it should check to see if you're on its own hotspot, and then you could not give this error message. But hey, we're nitpicking here. Once you've done that, you should see this setup here, and you've actually connected up to your standalone doser, which is pretty sweet. And from there, you can go in and set the time and date and assign the PAB device, which is important because we need to tell it what that PAB connection is. That's going to say that it's the Ion Director. So it gives you a very nice labeled step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. All easy enough there, pretty good. And we are a third of the way through setup, as easy as that. So let's roll on to step 2. All right, part 2, things get a little bit more involved here, because I guess in the part 1, we really just found a spot to put it, plugged one cable in, plugged power in first, plugged the PAB cable in, and downloaded an app. Here things get a little more interesting, so let's have a look. We've got to get the included tube, we've got to get the water sample filter, we've got to hook up some dosing pump heads, and we've got to find a spot for our reference fluid. So step 1, you've got to add these little connectors onto the dosing line, super easy. It does tell you some suggested lengths if you wish to stack the Ion Director on top of the doser or put it next to each other. One thing it does say is you should probably keep the lengths of these in mind, because at one point we do have to calibrate and put the lengths of tubing in there. I actually ended up putting my doser on top of the Ion Director. I don't think that's an issue. Didn't say anywhere that you couldn't do it. It just made more sense because the outlets of the dosing pump go down, and I was sitting in on a flat surface, and then I would have to bend them almost 180 degrees up to go up here. It made more sense to have them just go straight down to that, which means I probably could have had my tubes a little bit shorter, but hey, I left them the factory length just to 16 centimeters, 17 centimeters, and 18 centimeters, just to keep things all good. Now, it does tell you here which way the pumps turn, so you know which way they go, but it should be fairly self-explanatory there. It tells you to cut a piece of tube to go for the water sample and where to plug that in, cut a piece of tubing for the reference A, cut a piece of tubing for the reference B, and hook those up. Now, what do we got here? We've got to connect a piece of tube that's long enough to run from there. So we've connected the ones from the doser to the Ion Director. Now we've got to cut some from the doser to the water samples or reference fluids. So same sort of deal. You got to install the water sample filter, and then put that on, get that into somewhere in the sump, and make sure you take note of the length of the tube, because we will refer to that later. The reference fluids, pretty straightforward there. You got to cut them to the length you need. It says to keep them no longer than 100 centimeters each, but that was fine. Mine are about 40 or 50 centimeters, so that was sweet. And then it tells you to connect the wastewater tube from the Ion Director and the return. I am curious why we've got a wastewater and a return. I'm not overly sure why, but I think it's possibly something to do, and why one's at the back and the other one's at the front, but I think it's probably to do with the fact that they originally went from needing 4 pumps to only 3 pumps to run this, giving you a spare pump on the standalone doser. So yeah, we've got a vent and we've got a tube. The next step was a little clunky. This was preparing the pump heads for calibration. So you got to prime the fluids up, which thankfully you can do with some buttons on the unit. You don't have to do that through the app, to prime them anyway. And then you've basically got to go into the app and tell it you're going to calibrate, and off you go, do all that. Set it to a certain speed, calibrate pump, and then it wasn't overly intuitive, but then you put in there afterwards what the milliliters you got from that calibration run. It wasn't too bad. You got to do that with each of the pumps, so you got to do that 3 times. It's not too bad with the first one because that is just salt water. So you measure the fluid coming out, and then once you finish, you can just hook that back up to the Ion Director. You're good to go. I did find it a little bit awkward that it sort of tells you to hook up to the Ion Director, and then you got to disconnect from the Ion Director because you got to calibrate these pumps. I wish there was a step in there that said, before you hook it up to the Ion Director, let's prime and calibrate this pump. But oh well, you get that. The second and third pumps, though, you need to calibrate those with, just so you don't waste fluids, you've got to calibrate them with salt water. So you prime them up with salt water, you calibrate them with salt water, then you empty them from salt water, prime them back up with the reference fluids and put it back in. So it takes a little bit of effort, but we get there. And then there are some sort of awkward steps where you got to tell the doser what it's doing. So like your salt water levels are never going to run out, but your reference fluids will run out. So you got to tell it when the container's full and what size container it is. It's a little awkward, but it makes sense. I'll concede there. It wasn't too bad. So far, we're still in the good part of the setup. Okay, so that's the same sort of thing we're talking about there. You got to calibrate them. Optional, you can set up the fourth pump if you want to dose something. I did not. Let's skip that. Now that you've calibrated them, now you can install and position the tubes. So you basically clear them out, put them into your reference fluids, prime them up, and hook them back up into your Ion Director. And part 2 is done. So at this point in time, I was getting pretty excited. I feel like we're onto the final hurdle. Let's check it out and see how complicated that is. All right, part 3, completing the initial setup. We've got to enable the Ion Director. We've got to assign the pumps to the Ion Director. We've got to set up the general settings. We have to install the sensor and prepare for the first test. So we've got to go into the app, go into the Ion Director and enable it. Beautiful, easy done. Then we've got to go into the setup, general settings to the Ion Director. You've got to tell it to record the values, which makes sense. You don't want it to just test it and then forget it. So I don't know why that would not always be enabled, but sure, make sure it's enabled. Say how many times a day you want it to test, and then say what time you want it to test specifically, which is kind of awkward. So like whatever number of times you tell it to test, and then what time you want it to test, it will then break it up based on that. You can't sort of put a schedule in, which is kind of weird. So like it says here, if you want it to test 4 times a day in the first test at 12, it'll do 12, 6, 12, 6 to split it up evenly, which I don't know. I wish I could put a schedule in there. I did note that each test takes about 20, 25 minutes. So, could have put a schedule in, but so be it. We've got to put the setup a water sample settings. So this is where we've got to calculate. And I have to say this is pretty complex, or, well, it's not complex, but it's just more confusing than I felt it needed to be. You've got to put in the inner diameter of the tubing and the length of the tubing. You've got to add the volume of the inline filter, and then it'll calculate the volume of that line. It's all a little complex, but once you've done it once, you should be pretty good. Just one other little gotcha I came across here. Not only do you need to measure the length of the tube from the sump to the pump head, include the volume of the filter in that, you also then need to add the length of the tube inside the dosing pump head, and then add the length of the tube from the doser into the Ion Director. Seems like a lot of steps just to work out the volume of that tube. Now, select measurement mode is where you get to pick standard or high precision mode. Basically, you use a little bit more reference fluids in high precision mode, use a little bit more water, and it takes a little bit longer. You can see here the test time frames go from 24 minutes to 30 minutes. But it does bring your percentage from 3% plus minus down to 2% plus minus. I decided to go for normal mode just because I'm not sure how easy it's going to be to get hold of reference fluids, and I don't want to burn through it. So I left high precision mode off. But so far we're going okay. Setup's not too bad. We've got to set up the Ion Director parameter monitoring and alarms, which is basically just picking a nominal value, and then whether you want how far outside of that range do you want it to alarm. If you wanted to do a double check, which basically means how far it deviated from the previous test, do you want it to do another test to make sure, which is kind of just like a, well, literally as it's called, a double check, basically just means it's going to run another test and see whether it's actually believing what it says. Then we get up to one of the most interesting parts in the setup is prepare the MUI sensor. So you've got everything set up, you've got your lines primed, you've got the app set up, everything's good to go. Remove the foil or protective cap. Nope, had neither of those from the sensor. Keeps the sensor tip moist during transport. Nope, didn't have that. Place the sensor in suitable water container and slowly fill it with tap water or DI water. No salt water. So tap water's fine until the front sensor slot is completely submerged, which is this little bit here. Allow the sensor to soak for at least 30 minutes before proceeding to the next step. Man, I wish they told me this at step 1, because I've been sort of stuffing about with this thing for a couple of hours now. I could have had that sensor soaking the whole time. Why wait until I'm ready to do a test and then say, by the way, you've got to sit that down for 30 minutes in a cup of water. Anyway, it's all good. I had some work to do, so I sat it in a cup of water and moved on to the next step, which is installing the sensor. Now this, again, I am grateful that they actually gave you this measurement here, because it says do not use force when inserting the sensor, and it's got a very precise way it has to go in. It's got these little notches which will line up in there. I actually installed it nice and gently, and was all good and well. And I went and measured it, and I was nowhere near to 22 millimeters, so I had to actually push it in with a little bit of force. And I can understand they say don't like hammer it in there, but you'll need to push it in a little bit. Like it does actually take a little bit of force to get it in there, to get to that 22 millimeters or 0.86 of an inch. Then you tighten the lock nut down firmly. Now, things also get a little bit weird. It says to avoid leaks, you can tighten it up. But then it says you can use a 24 millimeter wrench to carefully tighten the nut, but don't use excessive force. You shouldn't need to tighten that up with a wrench. Like if you do it with your fingers, that should be enough to seal it up. We're not talking pressurized water in there. And then you hook up the sensor to the port on the back here, which the cable is really awkwardly placed for that. It has a very, it's the connector on the MUI sensor has a number of very delicate pins, and the cable comes out to the side here, and you've got to bend it around and try and shove it in this connector here. Super, super awkward, but yeah, I guess it works. Now, after the half-hour wait of the cup and water, I got to this step here, prepare for first Ion Director measurement. So you install the sensor, then you go into the maintenance section and you click Prepare Measurement Cell. It fills up the dosing pumps and primes them and does stuff and gets fluid in there. Then wait 12 hours before starting first measurement. Are you kidding me? So I had to wait half an hour with the sensor in a cup. Now I've got to wait 12 hours with this thing sitting there. And then after 12 hours, you can trigger a manual measurement by clicking this button. Man, I wish this was just built in. I wish when you connected the sensor, it checked and went, okay, this is the first time we've had a sensor connected. Would you like to prepare the cell? All right, we'll schedule the first test for 12 hours after this because you're probably going to be asleep at that point in time. But no, manually do it. And then it gives you some stuff to keep you busy in the meantime. You can optionally add the tile to your dashboard. And then it says you're done, which I guess technically you are. Unfortunately for me, I came across a bunch more hurdles to get this unit to a standard where I was happy. But let's go have a look at where it sits now, and I'll run you through what I did to get through those. All right, so now that I've got the Ion Director in place, all of the pumps calibrated, all of the lines connected, the probe has been soaking for a while, the probe has been inserted into the Ion Director and left to sit overnight for that 12 hours of initialization, whatever that may well be. It was finally ready to do its first test, and I manually kicked that off the next day and got some unusual results. Like it did come back saying my nitrate was up around 50 when my HANA checker is saying it's about 1.3, and some things like calcium was saying they were about 340 ppm when, whilst I know they're a little bit low, they're around about the 405, 400 mark. They're definitely not quite that low, but I figured that was the first test, no big deal. I know previously from automatic testers, sometimes you need to let them run a few tests before the results really kick in. So I figured whilst I waited for that, I'll get to work on setting up the Wi-Fi of this unit so that I can access it without having to get out the USB cable or having to connect up to it via its hotspot. And that's when things got a little bit interesting. The Wi-Fi setup itself should actually be pretty straightforward. You should be able to do it from the app in your phone. You can actually go into it, go into the Wi-Fi settings, tell it to search for the Wi-Fi, pick which one, put your password in, and hey presto, it'll just connect from there. Unfortunately for me, it wasn't quite that simple. I even tried getting out the Windows PC, connecting via USB and changing the settings there. And despite the fact numerous times, in fact, probably tried somewhere in the vicinity of 200 or 300 times of selecting my Wi-Fi, putting my password in, telling it to connect, letting it, or disconnecting the USB, letting it run through its process, giving it a few minutes to connect, it would continue to emit its own hotspot and would not connect to my Wi-Fi. At that stage, I started doing things like turning the 5 gigahertz network off, turning other things on my network off in case it was congested, doing everything. No matter what I did, I could not get it to connect via Wi-Fi. So thankfully for me, I found that the standalone doser does have an Ethernet port, and I figured, well, that's going to eliminate a heap of issues, particularly just for the purpose of this review. I'm not going to worry or waste any more time on the Wi-Fi. I'll just hook up that Ethernet cable and it'll connect and we'll move forward. Unfortunately not. This has to be the first device I've ever encountered in my life where I can plug an Ethernet cable into it and my network cannot discover it. I have no idea why. I went into the settings of it using the USB cable again, told it to connect via LAN. I knew that LAN cable worked because it was the one that connects to my KH Guardian that connects up just fine. It just wouldn't connect. I tried for 3 straight days to get this thing to connect to my network. Actually, I'll go back a step there. I tried for 1 solid day before going, you know what, I don't care. If I can't get it to connect to the Wi-Fi, it's no big deal. I'll just say that in the review. I'm really more interested in the results it gives. Enter the next little twist of the story. At that point, the unit had been running for about a day, day and a half, and had been doing tests every 3 or 4 hours. It was only then when I realized that I could not actually see the history of results. The Ion Director seems to, unless someone can tell me otherwise, only stores the most recent results locally on the machine. If you want to view the history, you have to connect it to the network and link it to the My GHL cloud service, where it will store your history for you. So until I could get that connectivity working, I was having to log into the unit either via USB cable or connecting to its hotspot, getting the results out, writing them down, which was, to be honest, a bit of a laugh for a device this high in price. So I persevered. I put in a ticket with GHL. I didn't get a response straight away, but I will point out here quickly, because I don't want to be too nasty to GHL. They did actually get back in touch with me about 2 or 3 days later, once the issue was all resolved, and said that they would even set up a Zoom session with me where they could remote in, we could work through it together. I've got to give credit where credit's due. That's superb service, albeit a few days after the fact, but if I wasn't trying to set this up for a review purpose, a few days later wouldn't be the end of the world, I guess. So kudos to GHL there for your support, but I think the setup process needs some revision. Now, in those few days while I was waiting for the connection to work and was not hearing back from GHL, I did have an overwhelming response from the community of people who are absolute GHL fanboys and absolutely love the brand. And I had probably in total about 8 people trying to help me through setting this up. And I did have a couple of people remoting to my computer, try for a while, give up after a while. A few people were going to be able to come down next week and actually play with the device in person here. We tried all sorts of things. We updated the firmware. Then I was told there's a separate firmware for the Wi-Fi. Turns out that's maybe not the case with the Doser, it is with the Profilux. To be honest, it was all totally confusing, and it doesn't automatically check for latest firmware. You have to download the latest GHL control center software, which includes the latest firmware, and then you need to tell it to look at that file. So there's a few clunky things there that GHL could really fix. I would highly recommend that it polls some sort of central server to check for a latest software and then downloads that, or at least prompts you to download it to then update the device. No such luck there. After another couple of days of firmware updates and tinkering with things, turning routers on, off, turning bands on, off, changing SSIDs, setting up hotspots from my phone, setting up old routers, I literally tried a million things, and I will not sugarcoat the fact that I probably swore more than I have in my lifetime trying to get this unit to connect. But I can say, after 3 incredibly frustrating days, for some reason it just decided to connect. I got no idea why. I didn't change anything, didn't do anything more than I'd done before. In fact, I got up in the morning and saw it wasn't connected, got my breakfast, sat down at the computer, and then I happened to walk past and saw that the blue light on top was on and it had connected. I don't know why, but hey, let's not rock the boat. It did connect, and finally I was able to start recording the history of my results. So yes, you heard that right. Until the device is connected to your network, which is connected to the internet, which connects to your My GHL cloud account, this device will not store the history of your test results. It only stores the latest results, and every time it does a test, it overwrites those results with the new ones. So at that point in time, I had a good few days worth of multiple tests per day that had just been overwritten, basically pouring the reference solution down the drain. So with that in mind, I do want to keep the accuracy and the results from this test to be in part 2 of the video, so I can go into a deep dive and see just how accurate the Ion Director is, because realistically, as difficult as it was and as much hair as I pulled out trying to set this thing up, once it's set up, if it is accurate and we can then dose some elements based off those accurate results, it could well be worth the effort, but I'll let you decide that. I will do part 2 in the next week or 2. I want to give this device plenty of time to build up a good history of results. Plus, I want to make sure I get enough time to get my ICP results back. In the meantime, if you have any questions or comments or feedback or anything you'd like to see covered in part 2 of the video for this GHL Ion Director, please put those comments in the section below. I do personally reply to each and every comment there, so it is the best way to get hold of me. Other than that, guys, I think I'll wrap the video up here. Thank you so much for watching as I go through all of the stressful aspects of setting up the Ion Director. Till next time, stay safe, keep reefing. Bye.